please welcome moderator Rick Volner and the Carbon Farming and Energy Crops panel.
First of all, when I was asked to moderate this great discussion on carbon farming and energy crops, the first thing I did was make sure that my understanding of the topic was accurate and in line with these great minds on this panel. So I did what most of people do, even though you may not admit it, I Googled it. And the standard definition of carbon farming that most references agree on is the use of farming methods that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and/or capture and hold carbon in vegetation and soil. This can cover small changes in land management like introducing no-till cropping, stubble retention, agroforestry, or methane-reducing feed supplements for livestock. At the other end of the spectrum, it can also mean developing an integrated whole farm plan to reduce emissions and maximize carbon capture that earn carbon credits that potentially could be capitalized on. Simply put, carbon farming involves implementing practices that are known to improve the rate at which CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and converted to plant and/or soil organic matter. Here at home, as we search for expanded sources of renewable energy on Maui, energy crops have been identified as an opportunity to produce firm, reliable, renewable energy. However, many common agricultural practices can result in significant carbon dioxide release. Through the use of some of the land management and carbon farming techniques mentioned earlier, can the agricultural sector and energy crop producers become net sequesters of carbon dioxide, or carbon, excuse me. With me today to expand our knowledge and explore this topic from the Mayor's Office, Office of Economic Development, Fred Redell. Fred is the Maui County Energy Director, joining the county in 2016. And he has worked in the solar industry and previously provided engineering services for energy facility developers. Fred, thank you for joining us. Also with us is Dr. Susan Crow. Dr. Crow is assistant professor from the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at the University of Hawaii. Dr. Crow's research group studies carbon dynamics and sequestration, greenhouse gas flux, nutrient and water management in natural and managed forest or agricultural ecosystems, and how these relate to global change pressures such as land use, climate change, and invasive species, sustainable agriculture, and renewable energy production as well. And also joining us, Charlotte O'Brien, founder and chief executive officer of the Carbon Drawdown Solutions. With a background in agriculture, Charlotte is a student of climate change and the benefits of soil carbon sequestration on global warming. She is the founder of Carbon Drawdown Solutions, Inc., a company that sells pyrolysis equipment for the purpose of making biochar and replacing fossil fuels with waste product energy recovery. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And Fred, if you'd like to kick us off.
Welcome. So clearly I'm not the mayor. This was the mayor's speech to give. I was informed of this recently. He does send his apologies that he could not make it, and I hope to do as well as he can. So clearly, I'm out of my element, but we're going to see what I can actually do with that. So let's start. So as Rick mentioned, carbon farming is simply this idea that you're reducing or capturing your greenhouse gases and holding them in the soils. Trees, plants, vegetation, all of those things in my engineer brain sort of says that on a larger time scale, this isn't what you're trying to do, because that portion would grow and eventually go into a control volume and cycle. But the reality is you need to have stuff sinking into the soils to actually capture carbon, just my engineer brain. So what would really fit here for Maui, for Hawaii, is really what's going to be part of the question, I believe. What plants, what vegetation would be planted to do carbon farming? Is it going to be something that's invasive, that is driven toward carbon dioxide or carbon sequestration? Or is it going to be native, which may or may not, who knows, do the same? And I think that that's what these experts here that are on the panel are going to be able to discuss much better than me, for sure. So, my first slide, let's see here, is this fun one. So I was drawing this up for the mayor because we sat down and wanted to talk about systems. And if I was to do something or do a project, what am I impacting? if I take from one spot, how am I, benefiting another spot? There's the direct and then the indirect look at any project. This idea, was rooted in trying to do good projects and trying to find ways to also be innovative. So with something like this, you could imagine, and this is not incomplete, it's just really for illustrative purposes. I wrote that there so no one can sue me, haha. No, but the idea again here is that you're really just trying to find, what are those opportunities? What feeds into what? Is there a way to do that process better? So part of this session included energy crops, and I was going to mention, we do have on Maui County, and you could probably trace this in the diagram before, a project that would use a biofuels, an energy crop, to run a digester process to then produce electricity, also use that waste heat to dry a sludge. There's other cycles that go back, like you would see on the diagram before that, the nutrient cycle coming back, and so on. And here, the idea, of course, is, what fits into that picture? Is this, something that fits, that can be doing better, more cost-effective than another solution? And so that's this project here, and hopefully it will start construction within the next year. Next that the county is looking into is a purchase of about 3,200 acres of land, looking into, is this the opportunity to pursue agroforestry? It's a hard word for me to say as an engineer. I'm like, what does that mean? I'm sure somebody here is going to tell us better than I can. But let's think about, though, and one of the interesting things that I didn't hear, but I didn't hear every single session, is, what are we talking about with the amount of carbon that we have to sequester if we were just even looking at our own impacts? And I looked up the EIA data, and alone for energy generation, I think it was 14.5 trillion tons, or no, 14.5 million tons of carbon is what we're emitting just because of the electricity sector. Expand that into transportation, it's huge, right? And that is really, at a scale of what we need to talk about. Are we going to take that all up with this concept? Well, what I was able to find by Googling it was, you might be able to put into the soils somewhere between 2 and 10 metric tons of CO2 per year. So, I'm not sure how accurate that is. I'm sure we're going to hear some experts on that, but that could be 30,000 metric tons for this one project. It's not a huge amount, but clearly we have to play with both sides of that equation. Emit a lot less and find the right things to do for projects. And back to thinking about that other slide that I first showed, the county has all of these other opportunities that we need to think about. What do we do with all of the resources we have? The recycled water, how are we going to dispose of that in the future? Where is the right place to go to that? We should start to look at, can we do an urban tree canopy in the Kihei area? This has many benefits. The mayor wanted to express, cooling that area, growing it, greening it, making it, very livable place. It'll reduce its energy demand. And those sort of ideas are still rooted back in that first very complex diagram I showed, which is there's these opportunities in here that we have to seek. If we're going to do carbon farming, we need to also pair it with all of these other things. Instead of using other intensive processes, let's use the opportunities we have to even do better. So thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Susan?
All right, so more about carbon. Specifically, carbon is a carbon atom. It's an element, right, that forms molecules and has mass, which is why we can measure it and trade it on a carbon market. It's quickly becoming a currency. And the currency really is of climate change and emerging as a key indicator of sustainability as a very general term. So a carbon revolution is underway, and as a scientist and researcher that measures carbon in our environment, I couldn't be more excited to be here today talking about this, potentially for the first time, hopefully not the last time with you guys. So thank you so much for attending, thank you for inviting me, and to all of the panelists. So as a scientist and researcher, I measure carbon. I measure carbon and greenhouse gas flux in the soil, where more carbon resides than in the atmosphere and trees, the part above ground that you can see. So trees, grasses, all of the biomass above ground. There's more in the soil than in the atmosphere and all of that above ground biomass put together. It's a really, really critical reservoir, a natural inherent capacity to store carbon below ground. And so I like to think primarily about what's below ground and that you can't see. So carbon from the atmosphere is fixed via photosynthesis. It lives as leaves, it dies, potentially falls to the ground if it's not harvested or is left behind in some of these practices that leave the residue behind, decomposes, is incorporated into the soil and through a variety of mechanisms and soil processes, stays there potentially for millennia. That's carbon sequestration, that it stays, regardless of what we do on the surface, whether it's a bioenergy, a biofuel, whether it's a food crop that we remove, that below ground system stays because of a variety of these soil processes. So not only have humans created an imbalance in the carbon cycle by emitting enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels into the atmosphere, but we've also degraded large land areas globally through deforestation and agriculture that was intensified by advances in technology for tillage and equipment and fertilizer production, right? And we're at the point now where that phase of development and technology is over and we need to move forward along a different path, right? So in Hawaii and globally, this ends now. We need to transition to a new era of sustainability across sectors, as we've been discussing today. And managed landscapes have an important role in achieving renewable energy, economic, food production, and societal well-being goals, both in the short term and in the long term. So Hawaii can lead the way here in this arena, just as in others that we've discussed all day. We're small, so we're a tractable system. We're diverse, and so we represent global variability in environment and people. And looking forward, there's an opportunity now to manage our ecosystems, manage our landscapes in a way for the future that improves the environment, the economy, and communities simultaneously, the triple bottom line that I've heard many people refer to today. And the common thread there, from my perspective, from my lens, the common thread through all of that is in improvement in soil health. And I say soil health rather than carbon sequestration specifically because they come together. There's more benefit in resilient landscapes than just carbon sequestration. There are lots of other co-benefits associated with building soil health. One of those benefits is carbon sequestration, others being multiple benefits. And by reforesting land and improving pasture management, increasing the use of conservation management practices, and food and biofuel production alike, we enhance the health of the soil. So carbon sequestration is one component, reducing greenhouse gas flux, reduce irrigation requirements, reduce fertilizer requirements. All of these have definable economic value. And with emerging carbon and ecosystem services markets, even the carbon and greenhouse gas flux now has a value to it. So we have a carbon economy, and we're at a critical point in time to make an impact. And it seems like we are all here because we want to be part of that impact. Essentially, the state hopes to enter into a payment for these ecosystem services framework through the enactment of Act 33, the Carbon Farming Task Force. And some of you, I know, are already ready to pay into that market, to contribute to that market in order to achieve your own internal carbon neutrality or greenhouse gas trade-off goals and other sustainability goals. But this move must be done responsibly. As a researcher that has measured carbon and these fluxes from the soil in agriculture, pasture, and forests here in Hawaii, There's a gap to fill between the state of our science and knowledge of carbon in the environment and our ability to project the capacity of landscapes, big and small, in Hawaii to sequester carbon with enough confidence to enter into the contractual agreement that will be a part of any jurisdictional framework that includes payment for ecosystem services across diverse landscapes. So from some of my group's work, we have seen that in some areas, there's 3 times more carbon in the soil than in the trees. I like your comment about trees come and go, right? Especially if they're in a managed system, but it's the soil that can maintain carbon, even as we implement these rotational harvest cycles in the above ground biomass. This is an example from the Big Island along the Hamakua coast. These soils are volcanic ash derived. They have an enormous capacity to store carbon, and there is an amazing amount of carbon within them. And so we ran one study where we did a land use change study. Part of payment for ecosystem services is that there's some payment for implementing a land use. In this case, it was a pasture area converted into forest, so a reforestation project. It's a managed eucalyptus forest, and the big take home is that due to natural heterogeneity and variability in the environment and soil, reforestation actually resulted in a net loss of carbon in some parts of the plantation. These happened to be up at the higher elevations where the pasture grasses had grown thick, deep mats, and there was an enormous amount of carbon that was lost upon land preparation and growing of the forests. In large tracts of the rest of the plantation, there was soil carbon gain as a result of the plantation. And so in that case, the land manager, had they had the goal of carbon sequestration, net carbon sequestration in mind, could have made a better and different decision about where to implement this reforestation project. Another example is from here on Maui, working for several years with HCNS, thinking ahead about biofuel feedstock production in a post-sugar plantation. After 2 years of growing perennial grasses in a zero-tillage management system, there was 3 times more soil carbon sequestered than the carbon equivalent of all non-renewable emissions associated with production. This is a great example of how choosing the right feedstock and managing it with the right zero-tillage ratoon management system, where you leave the below-ground root ecosystem intact, is critical to the overall carbon balance of the whole production system, and that will carry over into the whole energy production system as well if you go down the biofuel route. So we continued to measure increases in soil carbon for 4 years and ran simulation models that showed continued sequestration into the future, even under various warming scenarios. And we still observed a net increase over a 5-year period with one abnormal hot, dry year, where total soil carbon stock temporarily dipped as part of the natural heterogeneity in these soil processes, but then it went back up, and so the simulation models show with high confidence the continuation of accumulation of carbon into the future. So these are some specific examples, but we're lacking comprehensive research to extend our understanding of a few systems out into other areas. And this is a challenge that we will have to tackle if we move forward into this payment for ecosystem services framework. We're building a web tool to help communicate our knowledge and engage stakeholders from farmers to policymakers. Small farmers, big farmers, everyone alike should have an equitable opportunity to benefit from this financial valuation of soil health and associated co-benefits. So what we're lacking, critical resources to develop the technological advances and mathematical modeling needed to truly achieve our goals of providing a decision support and planning tool that will give that equal opportunity to all people, from small farmers to city and county planners to statewide legislators, to access these emerging carbon and ecosystem markets. So looking forward, a unique opportunity exists for innovation to converge research and conceptualizations of soil health, payment for ecosystem services into an accessible planning tool. to help define a future for adaptable, sustainable systems and integrated productive landscapes in Hawaii. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Charlotte?
So, good day. I'm not used to speaking to crowds, so bear with me. And somehow Rick and I misunderstood each other. I thought I was going to be on a panel. I didn't know I was going to stand up here and speak. So I'll do my best. This slide here is showing an example of carbon sequestration. What it's actually showing you is that there are mycorrhizal fungi underneath the soil that allow that toxic mine soil that has stood that way for 60 years to look, in only 18 months after treatment, to look like it does there with lots of grass and that sort of thing growing on it. Let's see. Oh boy, I'm just going to skip forward and come back to this. So, back. So I'm going to try to explain how carbon gets into soil. It all works because plants photosynthesize and they create sugars, and then they send the sugars down to the soil microbes, and those microbes convert it into a type of humus that is long-lasting. It's very, very stable. Some people say, well, anyways. So it's because the plants work with microbes, and the reason that conventional agriculture has resulted in so much carbon loss and carbon CO2 being in the air is because it's when you use chemical fertilizers, you kill the microbes. And if you don't have microbes, you're not sequestering carbon. So that has been the issue between conventional agriculture and what is called regenerative agriculture, which means to regenerate the soil to get more carbon back in. You get that nice black tilth to the soil. So I'll go back to those. So these are two brothers in Australia. They each farm sheep, one conventionally and one with regenerative systems. And so beside that fence, right, on either side of that fence, they dug in and they dug down to see what the soil looked like. Here's the chemical side. You can see it's just kind of brown soil. And on the other side, you can see it's starting to have some nice black soil. The exact same, they inherited the farm from their father, split it in two. One guy did regenerative, one guy did conventional. Keep digging, it's a really nice black soil. So then they tested that soil to see how much carbon was in the soil. So the brother that did the good agriculture got 90 tons per hectare of carbon in his soil, where his brother, they called him his neighbor, but it's actually his brother, was 43 tons per hectare of carbon. So in terms of drawing carbon down, it's a huge difference. And so it's a rate of 37 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, which is phenomenal. But in addition to that, the number of trace minerals that become available to the plant, because the old way of agriculture, the conventional way, is to say that you measure your soil and that's what the plant has to work with. But in reality, if you can get the microbes to work with the plant, the microbes there's actually a carbon exchange in the soil. So the plant gives the carbon to the mycorrhizal fungi. And the plant actually communicates with the fungi, says, today I need phosphorus. So great, the mycorrhizal fungi go out and they bring phosphorus back to the plant. The next day, the plant says, I need potassium. And they actually go out and say, okay, that potassium is too attached to that soil. They say to the bacteria, I'll give you some sugar if you will take that potassium off of that, if you'll use your enzymes, extract that potassium so I can take it back to the soil. So there's an entire carbon exchange going on under the soil that to me is very, very exciting to realize that nature is trying to help us to deal with climate change. So this photo here, those are not actually roots on that little pine tree. Those are actually mycorrhiza fungi, which work in conjunction with the roots and increase the, it gives the plant during drought, those little mycorrhiza fungi can bring nanoparticles of water back to the plant, more than the plant could extract with its own roots. And water cycle, so many people that talk about climate change are now realizing that it's water cycle as much as it is carbon. And the best thing that we can do, particularly here on Maui, where we could, according to Art Menderes, we are approaching a tipping point with our water cycle. If we go past, if we keep deforesting on Maui, we will no longer have a water cycle. And without a water cycle, we can't live on an island. So that's why it's really important that the mayor is doing an agroforestry reforestation project. And it's important that we get carbon on our soil because it's the carbon that absorbs the water and gives it back to the atmosphere. So, okay.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I think we all have a much better understanding of the potential for carbon farming, how carbon is sequestered in the soils. You touched a little bit on it, Susan, with Hawaii establishing the Carbon Farming Task Force in 2017. What does that really mean for a small farmer, a big farmer, a large landowner? What are the opportunities that exist across the spectrum?
So the Carbon Farming Task Force is tasked to do several things. One is to ask that very question. So trying to understand who can access the markets if they're set up. Another aspect of the Carbon Farming Task Force is actually doing the research currently to see if there's a registry out there that is accessible. Then we establish a baseline, so actually figuring out what we have now as a baseline assessment and a benchmark for moving forward. And also laying out the actual jurisdictional accounting framework for entering into an ecosystem service. I think currently we're still in the very early days. I think that gaining access for small farmers alike for big farmers is a really, really critical component to what the state will have as an objective. It was called the Carbon Farming Task Force for a reason. We want to include farmers, right? And it also includes not just pure carbon sequestration, which as you start tallying, right, larger land areas make more sense, you have more carbon sequestration. The focus of the task force was not, the language of the task force was not just carbon sequestration, but also soil health and building resilience. And I think that that's the critical component to understanding the additional co-benefits that, and in my opinion, is the pathway for entrance for even the smallest farmers. The registries have to be designed that way right from the beginning.
Perfect, thank you. Fred, you mentioned some of the projects that the county is embarking on, both on the energy crop side, but also where carbon sequestration and building soil health is very important. Besides those projects and some incentives that potentially government could provide, what other ways can government help or incentivize the participation in these programs for both small and large farmers and landowners as well?
Wonderful question for the mayor. I think, for sure, helping making sure a system is set up is going to be one of those first, ways that the county and the state and everybody can get together, and the mayor is a member on that carbon farming task force. So I think, when we were first even thinking about this conference overall, we were thinking to ourselves, well, without a price on carbon, gosh, you're going nowhere with a pure carbon play. There's not really a market there. So advocating for sure for that, that's not necessarily a direct incentive, but it is, something that should help move that market. When we get further out there, though, what the mayor was expressing to me was the idea that when we do these things, we need to find those opportunities where we're also not creating another intensive activity. And so when somebody's helping us solve the problem of where to put, recycled water, for instance, there should be a benefit there. And that recycled water should be coming at the right price that's incentivizing the ideas that, we're trying to achieve. And so I think that may be, as you know well, water could be an expensive part of this process. And we should try to do that in the least intensive way possible. And ultimately, using fresh water for the purpose of creating energy or for the purpose of creating a carbon sink is not the right thing, because we still have to think about our food, of course, unless your food crop isn't, intermixed. But the idea here is that we need to balance the right things, and that's really what I was trying to show in that first slide of all these things. We need that right balance. We need to solve our problems, and some of those are all interconnected.
So as the county is reviewing potential projects, it does evaluate and prioritize then the sequestration of carbon and how carbon farming could play into the role of that project going forward. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement to say that's somewhere we need to go. Absolutely. I don't think it's been so explicitly looked at, but with the Carbon Farming Task Force, it's now up, it's in the radar. It's part of something that the Department of Environmental Management has to take on and make sure that we're including that in our processes.
Thank you. Charlotte, is carbon farming, a very blunt question, is carbon farming economically viable, both at the small scale and the large scale?
I think absolutely. There are not a lot of people doing it yet because it's a very specific technology. It's a big learning curve for most people to get back into that sort of thing. It's a change of equipment. For example, we've been watching HC&S convert to cattle pastures, which is great. But, the soil was fallow for months. And number one thing is you can't have fallow soil, particularly not in the tropics. It's just learning those techniques and then developing equipment where you can sow a crop such as corn or soybeans right in a cover crop. So you're not plowing and disturbing the soil. You're just opening a wedge and putting it back in there. So you have to, and a lot of the equipment hasn't even really been fully developed. So.
Thank you. We're getting a number of questions, again, around the size. And again, because Hawaii, the average size of a farm is relatively small, compared to around the nation, but also backyard, yardners, gardeners, what kind of things can they do to help contribute to the sequestration of carbon?
Plant trees. Anybody can plant a tree in their yard and not use chemical fertilizers. Just do it naturally and let that tree sequester.
Any other? I don't have enough room for a tree in my backyard. What should I do?
I say if I ever see bare soil, it's the worst thing you can see. Bare soil almost guarantees that erosion and loss of that topsoil will occur. And where you lose bare soil from your yard or from a large abandoned agricultural landscape, it will be deposited somewhere. And in Hawaii, that tends to be in our near shore environment, causing damage to the reefs and the reef ecosystem, which just compounds the problems. So anything you can do to cover up the bare soil at the individual landowner perspective, I think is a good thing to do.
I can mess this up. This is fine. I think what's a weed? A weed is a plant in the wrong spot, right? But back to this idea that you don't want to have uncovered soil. There will be people out there who want a landscape that they want to get rid of the weeds and let erosion occur and let problems occur, when sometimes until you have a better solution, that weed is really your better solution. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but denuding the soils for the purpose of, for no real good purpose isn't going to serve you good.
Excellent. We have generally in the community lots of debates about food versus fuel, GMO versus non-GMO. In the case of carbon sequestration and carbon farming, are there any better crops? Are there any crops that we should not be growing? Is there any bad crop? Or are all good crops considered, as long as you're following good carbon farming practices, would they be considered good uses of the land?
Yeah, it's just a matter of keeping the soil covered, whether it's corn or whatever it is. You've just got to keep it covered. I
would think if you're trying to be economical, you would
of course, you want it to continue to grow and you have the right crops. So some of the invasive species or perhaps the albizia, something that might blow over in the wind, isn't going to be the best result because you're going to have a problem that you have to solve and start over again. So, the right things that aren't energy intensive from a water standpoint that work with our system already, if you could find those native species and grow that, I think you're going to, again, it's just my engineer brain, thinking that, that's going to be your better solution. Is going to be less intensive and ultimately more economical.
So one of the challenges here in Hawaii is that we have an enormous diversity of landscapes. We have very, very sharp environmental gradients. We also have very diverse population communities who need different things from their land. We have food, we have fuel, we've got fiber, medicine, cultural crops. So this in of itself can be a challenge, and that's why adaptive management systems are one direction that the Natural Resources Conservation Service at the national level, as well as here in Hawaii, are taking adaptive management systems, specifically soil health management systems. And that the soil health principles are common. So cover crops, never have bare soil, continuous living roots, and diversity in your cover cropping are among those principles of soil health. Then the management systems and the cropping systems can be very diverse, but as long as they hit those principles, then it's a good system for soil health and rejuvenating the life of the soil and the ecosystem of the soil. And so I find that to be a really, really interesting way to think about it. It can be a good crop, a good management can be different depending on where you're located, what your goal is, what your economic situation is, right? And that's why I like this concept for farmers in Hawaii, because even the smallest farmer can make decisions based within that construct of the soil health management system and adapt it to their needs while still maintaining the health of the soil and hopefully building the health of the soil and sequestering carbon and all of those other co-benefits. So if I had to pick a crop, I love ones with very big root systems, perennial grasses with a zero tillage management system that maintains that enormous below ground that Charlotte showed you and that awesome 1-inch seedling. So all of the biomass you can see above ground, there's just as much below ground, and then the extension out into the soil through that mycorrhizal network. And so anything that keeps an enormous, structurally sound, deep-rooted crop alive through multiple ratoon harvests in the case of the grasses, or trees that could be maintained in a zero-tillage management permaculture system, I think are good. I like roots.
Sounds good. I like roots too. In the climate change discussion, there seems to be two strategies, and obviously, combining the strategies is probably going to be most successful: reducing carbon dioxide emissions and sequestering as much carbon as possible. With the agricultural conservation lands that are available to us in Hawaii, is it a realistic goal that we can become a net positive sequester? So sequestering more carbon than we're actually emitting.
Yes, once you get rid of emitting a whole bunch. I mean, back to what I was trying to say was 14.5 million tons of carbon per year in just the electrical sector is a whole lot of carbon. And I think in the project I was noting, and then using your numbers, I did some calculations from hectares because I don't normally use those, but it's a little bit more than what I was guessing, but you're talking maybe 45,000 tons for that one project that you might be able to sequester per year. That's a lot less than 14.5 million. So I think we absolutely have to work in both directions, but the emissions are huge.
But I'm really excited about the mayor's idea of agroforestry, because that's the potential. That's the real potential. We look at how much bare land that we have on our island, and it didn't used to be that way. We talk about desertification around the world, and one day I was out on a boat coming into Lahaina, I looked up and thought, oh my God, desertification. I didn't even realize that it was on my own island. That's what I'm reading about in Africa and Asia and stuff. There it was. It happened a long time ago, before anybody understood. But we have to reverse that, and the only way to reverse it is with plants.
I like sitting next to engineers, and I like collaborating with engineers because you make calculations like that very quickly. And I like I like hearing the big numbers. You know, my gut feeling says yes, we can absolutely achieve carbon neutrality, particularly as we make these progressive movements towards 100% renewable, because I think that getting the emissions out of the equation is going to be critical. But I go with my gut sometimes. And I think we can do it. And I collaborate with engineers and with other scientists who do the whole systems approach, thinking about the economics, because together we can one day have a concrete answer to that question and a path forward to achieve it.
And I'd like to add something to that. You know, we have 8 million tourists that come every year into our islands, and they're coming for the beauty of the islands. If they each paid $10, that's $80 million that we could use for systems like this around the islands to keep it beautiful. Because without carbon, our islands will lose their beauty quickly.
Excellent points. Fred, going back to some of the mayor's projects that he's prioritizing, some of which involve growing of dedicated energy crops. Are there specific examples, you know, in other places, whether in the United States or throughout the world, where a project like that is taking place and you know, carbon farming practices are being implemented?
Well, I don't know for sure on the carbon farming side. You know, I used to work for a large Spanish company. Part of our operations included a very large, you know, biofuels operation, ethanol. And most people say, "Oh my gosh, you were growing corn." Absolutely, they were. That was the thing that was in at that moment. I think what we're seeing though is this deep learning about what are the right things to do. Right? I believe they switched to a second generation ethanol at some point, and that was one of the next projects that we were doing in Kansas. But ultimately, you need to do what you know, these folks are talking about. You need to do good native things that aren't just, again, energy intensive. And I think really what I wanted to say, you know, when we're defining something as renewable, I think ultimately we have to get away from that definition. We have to get to a point where we're measuring the carbon intensity of each operation and then valuing that renewable thing, which is just a made-up term, and saying, this is the carbon intensity. And that's when you're going to get to, you know, can my activities be balanced by this sink? I think that's what we have to get to.
Great. So in 30 or 40 seconds, Charlotte, what would be the biggest takeaways that you'd like the audience and people that are going to watch this to know about carbon farming and the potential for Maui and Hawaii as a state?
Well, just to begin to realize that it's the plants that'll do it for us. And to think of the entire surface of the world, if each area did this, we could reverse climate change and reverse the problems that we're having with water cycles, because what is climate change? It's severe weather. It's either too much water or not enough water. And that all goes back to that small carbon cycle that we are seeing being destroyed on our own island. The last 25 years, you know, our water cycle has changed tremendously. And we can't let that keep going.
Thank you. Susan, same question.
I think a re-envisioning of Hawaii's agricultural future is overdue. Think sustainable agriculture that can be intensive, can still be sustainable, integrated, managed landscapes that can serve multiple purposes across multiple sectors, forestry, agroforestry, ranching, farming, meeting multiple energy, economic, and environmental goals.
Thank you. Fred?
What was the question? I'm kidding. You know, the one takeaway though, I think is, and really what the mayor has been, you know, pushing into my brain and really making, you know, leaning into me on is we need to always look at things as the total system. We need to look at what are those impacts, you know, that we have around those, what are our opportunities, and not just ignoring one item for another.
Great. I want to thank all of you panelists for your wonderful insight and discussion. This has certainly raised my understanding of carbon farming, and I hope the audience as well. the agricultural component of our community has always been there, and it's a very important part of our past and I think our future as well. And so I hope to see, many of the projects that the county has talked about, being implemented, and some of our small and large farmers, participating in the carbon farming, potentially financially in the future as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.